So we're gonna do a quick live demo, but essentially in order to do these demos, the easiest thing to do is to go to docker.com and search for Docker for Mac or Docker for Windows, depending on your system. And from there you can kind of follow some of our stuff. And we've downloaded some images just because our internet here is not the best. I don't think they can see this right now, so screen share. Hey guys. Everybody left, right? They were like, oh, we're done. We're out of here. Done.
No, yeah.
Cool. So essentially what we're going to just do is just show that we have Docker here, right? So Docker version. And again, this is as simple as going to docker.com, downloading Docker for Windows or Docker for Mac, and installing it. And it's probably it's the easiest install it's ever been since Docker's been around, and I love it.
Hey, Richard.
Yes, sir.
So I installed Docker before they had like a DMG file for it. Which version are you using? Like when I downloaded it, it was the CLI version. And
yeah. Did you download it when it was like Docker Toolbox or when did you get it?
Yeah, it was the one that was past Docker Toolbox. Because when I went back to it, now it's like, I guess it's an app.
Yeah, so there was like, at different times there was different things. There was like Kitematic at one point. There was boot to Docker. There was all these kind of like clunky stuff. I would like get rid of anything Docker related, delete it, uninstall it, and then just download Docker for Mac. Docker for Mac works amazing. Like,
okay.
It's actually, I mean, I mostly run on Linux, on all our kind of VMs and stuff. But I'm actually this is my first time using Docker for Mac, and I'm like, why don't I have this on my main Mac? Like, this is ridiculous. Like, I was using Docker Toolbox, and I'm like, no, this is way better. Like, it's so much more easier to use.
Okay, cool.
Okay, cool. So what we're gonna do is, let's see here, Docker images. Let's see here. Okay, cool. Okay, we're going to start with something basic, which is Docker run hello world. And again, you guys don't necessarily have to follow. I just want to kind of show examples and kind of give it. If you do want to download that, it's a pretty easy install, and you guys can catch up. It's not hard to do that. So we're going to do this, and what this will do is download an image called Hello World, and from there we'll be able to show our first container running. So I'm going to fire that off, and so it realizes immediately that there's not a image called Hello World locally, and then it pulls it from Docker Hub, and then once it has that, it ran this little command inside of there. So hello from Docker. This message shows that your installation appears to be working correctly. Blah 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 blah. We could also do what it recommends, which is, I don't know how long this is going to take, and I'll see very quickly. But so essentially, when you're downloading stuff, you just run Docker, the main CLI command, and then you give it a command. So in this case, it's run, and then we're going to run it interactively with teletype, and then pick the image that we want, and then fire the command we want to run inside of the container. So in this case, what we've just done right now is we pulled an Ubuntu base image, and we asked it to run the command bash. And because of saying we want to keep it interactive teletype, we're allowed to be connected here. So now I'm inside of a full Ubuntu, and this is just a container. I can just go ahead and kill this guy, and I can just run that again. And as you can see, this number changes between these two right here. These are two different containers that spun up. And that's how quick it took to spun up an Ubuntu container. And I can do, you know, whatever I can do. Hello. How do you spell your name? Right?
Yeah, you got it right.
Right? That's better, right? I found right. There you go. Okay, cool. So that shows that it's very easy to pull these images down. And again, like at this point, what you start realizing is like, okay, cool. I have a full image to work with that's a full VM. It's like you just spun up Ubuntu right there, and you could do anything you want inside of it. You know, I could SSH into another system if I wanted to. And it was that quick to spin up and to kill. So let's get started. So what we have in this folder is we have 2 files that we have already pulled down, which is the Docker file, right? Cool. Hey, just so you know, Lewis, I'm still using the arrow keys on my Vim. So, oh, and Isaac would that still too.
Craig,
Actually, this is Josh's Vim setup. So this is, if you look at my Vim, it's like super basic. It's like probably like not even syntax highlighted or anything. So just as we saw before, this is essentially a pool from this is a Docker file here, and it's pulling from Ruby 2.2. So you get Ruby 2.2. And then it installed the build essentials and installs Node.js, and it goes through everything that we kind of talked about before in the other app or inside of the slide. So we'll kind of get out of this for a second. Okay, so we have the Docker file there. Okay, there we go. Okay, so let's see. Okay, there we go. Let's start from scratch. Source gem, Rails, 4.2.0. Have you been on Rails 5 out of curiosity?
Yeah.
I haven't used it.
Okay, great. Awesome. We'll add a gem file block. Okay, great. And then essentially, we're going to go over this other file that we've already downloaded. And again, this is all inside that tutorial, that link, and I posted it inside of the Google chat, and it'll be shared in the meetup. And so this describes our Docker Compose file. So what we're saying is we're going to describe our services that we have. So in this case, we only have a 2-tier web app, right? So we have a database, and we're using Postgres in this case. And we have a web service, and essentially that will build that dot is current directory. So that means we're going to build off the Docker file we currently have. And then we're going to fire off the command that we want to run, which in this case is a Rails command. And then volumes is essentially where you want to store data. So in here we're saying let's store locally to this directory, and we'll map it to this folder inside the container called my app. And then we'll essentially say anything on the port 3000 on the container, which is effectively the guest, will match 3000 port on the host. And this service needs to depend on database service, which means that the database service must be up before this can be executed. Okay, and then from there, we're going to go ahead and build a project. So I'll kind of go through how this command was kind of constructed. What the heck is SK? Okay, so to kind of go over can everybody see this line right here?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so the main item is Docker Compose. That's the main command to run. And that's essentially saying we're going to load up that YAML file that we just talked about. And it's going to go ahead and run. It's going to run and create images based from there. In this case, we're going to run the web service specifically. So we said we're going to say Docker Compose run web, which is that service. And then we're going to go ahead and fire off a command inside it. So all this now, oh, I can't highlight like that, but all this now is essentially commands that are now piped into the container after it's been instantiated. So in this case, it'll run Rails new dot current directory, and then make sure that it has a Postgres database, and it'll skip any bundling process. And it'll fail immediately. And it displays any real application in the directory. Oh, I see.
Okay, so yeah, do it again.
Yeah. Oh yeah, that's a good point. Cool. All right, let's try that one more time. Woohoo! Okay, cool. So we just did a normal Rails setup. That's all we did, and we ran that in that container. Now yours, when you run that, will actually build a container. Just FYI, it'll be pulling down the Rails container in order to do that. What we're gonna do now is make sure that we have a JavaScript runtime. So we're gonna check that gem file real quick. Now that we have built a new Rails app, all this was added, and we're gonna go ahead and remove and comment this section right here. Okay, so that gives us our JavaScript runtime, and then we're gonna run Dagger compose build, and what this will do is it'll do a bundle install now with that updated, with that uncommented out.
We added one more gem, so we need to rebuild.
Actually, okay, so essentially what it did though is it started off from Ruby 2.2, right? So it downloaded this image from Docker Hub, and now it's running what we asked in the Docker file, which is essentially adding the build install package, Postgres development, and then Node.js. And it's going to add all those packages, and then pretty soon this should be updated. Once we have that, we'll be able to connect to the database. So I'm going to let that kind of do its thing. But honestly, I can go ahead and run that same work, by the way. Down or up. And then, oh yeah, can you do that? I probably removed everything. So. Right now, all we're doing is we're just adding the database configuration item right now. So. Oh, there's another window. Okay, so that's almost done, running right now. So is there any questions right now? I know we're kind of bouncing around on a bunch of items right now, but essentially all we're doing is just doing Rails in the context of Docker. As you can see, the only commands we've kind of introduced is a build step, and that's pretty much it. There's got to be some questions in there somewhere, right? Everyone's just like, oh, I'm glossed over. I'm glossed over.
Questions?
Isaac, how are you running Docker in production?
I'm running Docker from a company called Grok that they set up, and then I'm running Docker for another deal. I always have issues with exposing different ports to other ports, in particular with the web app connecting to a database. But then again, I'm building mine from scratch, which was the first thing we said not to do.
Well, no, I mean, like, so yeah. So if you're building your database container from scratch, then that might be a little bit, yeah, kind of a little bit convoluted. But honestly, as soon as you open up the port, you should be fine. Like on most of those, like in Postgres, what is it, 5432 or something like that? And then as long as you have links associated to that database, you should be fine. It should be pretty relatively easily, because then what Docker does is actually go inside and then modifies the etc host file, and then actually like just adds the link according to the IP of that container.
Okay, and so I do have well, one, I've just been reading up on it, and I saw the Docker exec, where you SSH into the Docker, which is my first kind of go-to. And then I read
Don't ever do that. Don't do that.
Yeah,
Don't.
I read an interesting article saying that if you're doing that, then you're doing it wrong.
Yeah, you are totally. Yeah, that article was 100% right.
Okay. So I saw you doing that, and I was like, well, maybe.
Like, so the reason why though is because, like, if you're kind of thinking about how the code is set up, is the fact that like every one of these should be able to be killed at any one time. Like, all these are ephemeral in nature, right? Like, you could be able to kill these containers anywhere. A machine could fail, and it should be able to pick back up somewhere else. Now, if you just SSH into something and change it, it's just like SSHing into some VM on a server. Something happens, that server goes down, and now that information is now lost, and you can't reconfigure that or bring it back up. So that's why it's not really used. You would modify the Docker file to support whatever you wanted, or modify your code to support whatever you wanted.
Yeah. So I think the biggest thing for me is figuring out how I want to expose or what to expose for my development. And it's all to set up my development locally. And I think the second part, which once I get there locally, that I have no clue on, is how to deploy.
How to deploy?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so, and it just depends though. If you're deploying, I mean, it sounds like everything right now, and I don't know if I'm accurate or not, but it sounds like it's a single host deployment. Is that correct? Or are you on like multiple VMs and it's like a whole?
No, it'd be single app deployment.
Yeah, so, but are you in a single VM or a single?
So the VM would have different containers. I don't know if that's what you're talking about.
Okay.
A container.
It would. Let me finish this real quick, because I do kind of want to go into that, because it would help explain some stuff, I think, at a very high level. So at this point, like, we're pretty much almost done, actually. We already built everything we needed to build. So, and just so you know, every time you add something to Docker, every line, it creates a cache of what you made. So if you never change anything before that, then you can always use that base to then add more containers or add other layers. And then essentially we're just gonna boot this up. So let's see here. So boot that up. Postgres is yelling. Okay, we'll make sure that. So we're gonna go ahead and run a rake db create, and that just kind of finish us off.
So while that's finishing, I have a funny story real quick.
Yep.
I did Docker compose up, and I kept wondering why it was freezing. And apparently, if you ran like -d, Docker compose up -d runs into the background.
Yep.
Yeah. I didn't run -d, and I thought it froze.
Oh, that's pretty funny. So you were just in attach mode.
So I was looking at the terminal saying, what the freak is freezing this? But no, it was running, and I had no idea. It was funny. Afterwards.
It's running in the foreground.
Yeah, it was running in the foreground.
Why doesn't this continue?
Yeah, so right there, I did the same thing, I think. We're very close to it. So now we have a live running Rails server running. So what we see now, though, is you see a container running, and the command that it's running against, it's running Rails S. And we are now listening, or port 3000 is being directed to port 3000 on the host. And then database doesn't have anything going to the host. All it is exposing is 5432 to itself or to its own container. However, this test web does know about this Postgres. So kind of on what we're talking about, Isaac, to kind of show you that if you did do Docker exec, I'll show you when Docker exec actually is kind of cool. So Docker exec, and then we go into test web, and then we throw in a bash command to get into it. I think it actually, what is it? Oh, that's right, because of compose, you get that. That's right. Okay, so now I'm inside of that running container, right?
Yeah.
You really shouldn't edit anything, but if you need to look at something, it's totally fine. So you can see our whole app is inside there, and I'm inside this container right now. So I can go ahead and go to, so inside of here, it's added the other container, which is the Postgres. What the hell did I know the other Postgres? Oh, am I in there? Which one am I?
You're on the web.
Oh, it's a DB container that knows about it. What?
Means it has a link to DB.
Oh, it is a link to DB. Okay, okay. Sorry, my fault. The wrong thing. DB.
Okay.
Test web 1, test DB 1. 1 second. Hopefully I don't look like a giant fool on this. It actually doesn't have each other actually, so. Oh, actually there is no links actually between these two.
Depends on creative.
Oh, it depends on.
Yeah, what's the
Oh.
difference between depends on and link too?
Yeah, actually I need to.
Starting. It's
It's-
new.
it's a starting
new,
word.
It's new in 112.
Yeah,
Depends on.
it's a newer thing, so I'm actually kind of curious. Yeah, I need to look on that one. I actually don't know the difference entirely on that one. That is, I usually use links, honestly, all the time. Oh, I see. Okay, so for containers that are linked, services will be reachable at a host name identical to the alias or service name. If you did depends on, it doesn't. Okay, cool. So depends on is the order, and then links would be actually so you can use the host name. So if I wanted to use a host name DB inside of here, I can go ahead and then do links DB. Okay, and then that should. Okay. Okay, I'm not going to go too deep into that because I feel like I'm going to go down a rabbit hole. But I use links most of the time, and that way I can use aliases there.
And the depends on is pretty new to Docker 112.
Hopefully that kind of gives you a quick rundown of Docker. It may have been more confusing than I would have liked to present. Any questions, please?
A hosting provider where I can play with Docker, like let's say, I don't know, an easy one where we can install Docker on our machines and deploy it, simulating production.
Yeah, I would look at, I mean, right now for testing out, a Docker Cloud would probably be a good option. You know, it's kind of holistic and it kind of has a very easy flow in comparison. If you want a VM that has a Docker installed, like a Linux machine that has Docker installed already, you can use DigitalOcean. I've heard that Amazon's ECS is not as helpful quite yet, so what I would say is DigitalOcean's Docker container would be, Docker VM would be a good idea. Would probably look at Docker Cloud first.
Okay, thank you.
If you're not building your whole infrastructure by yourself, I mean, if you are, then you can run it on AWS or whichever. Lewis, you got a question, man? I assume. No, Lewis doesn't have a question.
Well, okay, maybe I do have a question. Like when we run our Docker command, which I don't know how it's set up, it seems like it's what's that?
I think it's alias.
You have a gem file for it.
Yeah, we have a gem for it. It seems like it's really slow. Like what should we look at to speed it up?
What part is slow? Like a build step or a startup step or?
I guess the startup stuff. I'm not exactly sure what it's doing.
So there could be a couple of different things though. Like it just depends how you guys have your stuff mounted. Like it could be one of those things where when you're, it just depends on the Docker file. Like I would start at the Docker file. Look at the Docker file and look at the Docker compose file if that's what you're using for that. Because essentially that defines everything. And what could end up happening is, like, for instance, we had a piece where we were running, like, say, bundle install after we were saving the code. So then what would happen is every time we changed the code, bundle install would occur. So then that had just added a bunch of time. And then the difference is sometimes where every code change could impact things that don't really need to happen. Like, for instance, like if you had host level storage, then you would be mounted directly to the container. So you would never have to actually rebuild the image. Sometimes, depending on how people structure their app, they could have to rebuild the image on every single, code modification you make. I don't know if that's currently how you do it right now or not. But if the slowness is happening from there, I mean, it shouldn't take that long for anything, honestly. Like, is it startup time or spin up time or?
I don't know exactly, but it probably takes like 2 or 3 seconds.
It
What do you
depends. Sometimes it really depends on I guess how much it's trying to start up, and I guess how much it's like building upon it. I'm not sure if that makes sense in the context of it being layered images, but when we spin up a Docker container, it will take a while to start running, and then it will also take a while to deploy any changes that you make inside of the environment. So if I have it running and I make a change, it could take up to 2 minutes before the change displays onto the screen. So it sends that change to the server, I guess. So the display rate isn't happening as quickly, and then upon initial load, it takes a good,
Wait, is this locally or is this when you're pushing?
locally. It's not. It's in development
locally.
environment. It's not in a staging environment or anything.
Oh, okay. Like honestly, like I mean, that sounds like you should look at your volumes and how your volumes are set up. Like technically, you shouldn't have to actually do any build step for code changes. Like if you're doing a build step while you're doing code changes, like that gives way more. Like there's no reason why you should kill a container unless like you're modifying something that would really affect that you would actually need to restart your entire server for. So like if you're running it without Docker and you modified some code and say it's like HTML and you modified some code in HTML, you shouldn't have to rebuild anything because you're like mounted to that container. But it does depend on how your system is set up, how your Docker file is set up. Like your Docker file's volumes are set up in a way where effectively you have to build every time you essentially add the code. Like a 3-second delay could be because of the fact that it's adding the code again, and then creating a new container. Like if you just look if your container ID changes actually. If you're like the image name, if the image ID changes every time, then you're creating a new image every single time on that step. And if you're doing that, you should remove that build step.
And check your space.
Good plan.
Yeah. I need to dig into that. Okay, that kind of answers my question. I think we're pretty far over time, so.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. Probably so. Yeah. Sorry.
I don't want to keep people.
I was like totally afraid that I was like not gonna say enough, and that's never the case apparently.
Any
Always be
other
confident.
quick questions? Anyone
No,
else?
it was like, I need to get the hell out of here, man.
Does anybody have any 2-second questions?
All right, guys.
Thanks, man.
Thanks, Richard.
Appreciate it.
Thanks.
Sorry for overstaying my welcome.
come back to Geekdom sometime.
Yeah, man. Seriously. All right, man.
All right, thanks. Later.